Surveys show that most people report at least one coincidence, so striking it seemed filled with meaning. A thought of someone before they call, an encounter with a stranger sharing your exact birthday, or a chain of events that lines up with uncanny precision. Researchers describe this through two lenses: noticing coincidences as they occur and interpreting them as significant. Both are part of how synchronicity awareness forms. We'll test whether these moments are simply products of the brain's selective filters and pattern-hunting tendencies, or whether science still leaves open the possibility of deeper connections between mind and reality. Jung's original mystery. Carl Jung once sat across from a patient who resisted his analysis, a woman tightly bound to rational thinking and dismissive of any symbolic interpretation of her dreams. During one session, she recounted a vivid dream about a golden scarab. At that very moment, Jung heard a tapping sound at his office window. When he opened it, he caught a beetle unusual for the region, one that closely resembled the scarab of her dream. He handed it to her, and the timing struck her so forcefully that her defensive attitude began to soften. For Jung, this was more than coincidence. It became the central anecdote he would use to illustrate his later concept of synchronicity, which he described as meaningful coincidences that cannot be explained by a linear chain of cause and effect. The episode represented, for Jung, a turning point that suggested inner states of mind could align with external events in ways not yet accounted for by existing science. He did not see the scarab simply as a curious overlap, but as an instance where unconscious content and lived reality resonated. To him, this indicated that meaning could emerge without one event directly producing the other. At a time when psychology was steadily moving toward experimental rigor and strict behaviorism, Jung's reflections stood apart. He proposed that meaning was not only an internal construction, but sometimes revealed itself through events outside the psyche. His framing unsettled the notion that all events must follow predictable, causal laws and opened a space where coincidence could carry significance. From the beginning, synchronicity drew criticism. Many in the scientific community dismissed the idea as mystical rather than empirical. Yet even critics acknowledged that Jung's scarab example was striking because of its timing and the dramatic effect it had on his patient. What made the idea divisive was its position between two worlds. It drew one foot into psychology and the other into mystery. For Jung's followers, synchronicity suggested that symbols, archetypes, and unconscious processes found echoes in lived experience. For skeptics, it seemed to introduce a breach in reason, an unnecessary appeal to the unseen. Aware of these tensions, Jung tried to nuance his concept by placing it within broader conversations about science. He corresponded with Nobel Prize-winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli, exchanging ideas about whether unusual alignments in psychology might be compared with puzzling phenomena in physics. They discussed parallels between archetypal meaning and the non-local effects observed on the quantum level. Importantly, these conversations did not amount to scientific proof of synchronicity. They were exploratory dialogues that highlighted conceptual echoes across disciplines. For Jung, it was about finding language to frame synchronicity as more than superstition, but also not as a proven physical law. Today, in 2025, we can see how far the field has advanced with tools Jung never had: neuroimaging, global surveys, and data-driven analyses of probability. We can track how memories bias perception, when pattern recognition ignites in the brain, and how cultural expectations frame the stories people tell about coincidences. Still, whenever synchronicity is discussed, the story of Jung's scarab resurfaces. The fact that a single anecdote remains a reference point more than 80 years later speaks to how deeply it resonates, and how much the question it raises remains unsettled. Modern science dissects such moments through multiple lenses. Neuroscientists show that the human mind is tuned to find order within randomness, to connect separate events into a coherent picture, even when no objective link exists. Psychologists explore how attention selects what we notice and filters out what we ignore. Statisticians examine the probabilities to show that rare overlaps are expected when large numbers of events are considered. Yet the scarab story continues to pose the same underlying problem. How do we decide whether a perceived pattern is merely imposed by the mind or whether it indicates some deeper alignment? The scarab also carries historical relevance because it represented more than a private moment inside Jung's imagination. Both analyst and patient witnessed the occurrence, which set it apart from the countless personal coincidences that cannot be independently confirmed. That shared witness gave the story a durability that kept it alive within Jung's writings and among his readers. The power of the example lies not in empirical proof, but in its dramatic illustration of how coincidence can pierce ordinary expectation and demand meaning. In psychology today, the scarab is often used not as evidence, but as a symbolic starting point. Researchers contrast Jung's interpretation with modern concepts such as selective attention, memory bias, or statistical chance. The anecdote serves as an entry point. It encapsulates the question of whether coincidences can ever point to something beyond probability, or whether they illuminate only the brain's hunger for order. Jung's distinctive contribution was insisting that coincidences could be meaningful even when no causal explanation was available. While science favored the principle that every effect must have a cause, Jung's acausal connecting principle carved out a radical alternative. Meaning could connect events even when causation did not. This conviction sparked controversy then and remains debated now. Researchers today remain cautious about claims that suggest external reality bends to inner thoughts. But advances in brain science, data analysis, and physics allow synchronicity to be examined from angles Jung could never have considered. Whether these tools will confirm, reshape, or diminish Jung's claim is still an open question. It is important to note that Jung himself emphasized that synchronicity was not about coincidences in isolation. A beetle breaking through a window screen was not remarkable by itself. What mattered was that its appearance coincided with the patient's scarab dream, and that the connection broke through her resistance in the therapy session. Timing, symbolism, and psychological impact combined to form what Jung called a moment of meaning. That triad, external event, inner state, and significance, is what he regarded as the hallmark of synchronicity. While modern research often reduces such events to statistical or cognitive processes, what keeps people interested is precisely the lived experience of coincidence that seems to matter. This is why the scarab continues to hold symbolic weight. It marks the beginning of a framework that, whether accepted or doubted, refuses to disappear. From a quiet office in Switzerland in the 1940s to the data-driven studies of the present day, the question it raised is still alive. Was the scarab a random overlap given shape by the human mind, or a sign of hidden order? To critics, it remains nothing more than an insect arriving at a convenient time. To those intrigued by synchronicity, it represents the possibility that reality and psyche resonate in ways that matter, even if they escape ordinary explanation. And this enduring tension leads naturally to another important issue. If these meaningful coincidences are truly exceptional, why do so many people insist they encounter them again and again in their own lives? How common are synchronicities in 2025? In 2025, researchers are no longer asking whether synchronicity happens. They are asking how often and under what conditions it appears. What used to live mainly in personal diary entries and anecdotal stories has now been systematically studied across large groups of people. Multiple projects point in the same direction. Meaningful coincidences are a common human experience, not because they happen to everyone every day in the same way, but because most people can recall, and often continue to notice, events that feel uncannily aligned with their inner world. Large-scale surveys over the past several years show that a majority of adults, regardless of culture or worldview, report at least one meaningful coincidence in their lives. But instead of relying only on memory-based surveys, some scientists have taken a different approach, asking participants to record events in real time. This method reduces retrospective bias and highlights patterns of when and how synchronicities are actually noticed. One prominent example comes from Rominger and colleagues, who reanalyzed daily diary data about coincidences. They found that a substantial share of recorded days contained at least one perceived coincidence. In fact, the variation was not just from person to person, but also within the same person across time. About a third of the variance lay between individuals, with the rest influenced by daily context and state of mind. This finding suggests that synchronicity is neither a constant tendency nor a rare anomaly. Rather, it ebbs and flows, dependent on both dispositional traits and the shifting situations people move through. Awareness is not the same as meaning. Building on this, researchers frame experiences using the SAMD model: synchronicity awareness versus synchronicity meaning detection. Awareness refers to simply noticing that events line up beyond expectation. Meaning detection adds interpretation, the act of linking the event to something personally important. You might notice that you run into the same colleague twice in one day, but whether you frame it as chance or destiny depends on meaning detection. Surveys show both aspects are widespread, but they do not always overlap. Many people notice coincidences yet dismiss them as trivial, while others label even minor overlaps as profound. These categories help explain not only differences across individuals, but also across cultures. Interpretation varies dramatically with worldview. In some traditions, coincidences are framed as messages, whether from ancestors, spirits, or a divine source. In communities influenced by technology and science, the same experience might be cast as an odd probability or a glitch in the system. Younger participants in recent studies increasingly lean on digital metaphors, treating unusual alignments as if reality were miscoded by an algorithm. In contrast, others describe synchronicities through lenses of fate, karma, harmony, or interconnectedness. The common denominator is not the explanation, but the recognition of the event itself. This cultural flexibility means synchronicity persists generations after Jung first named it, because it adapts to whatever conceptual tools a community has at hand. The surveys also show that for many, synchronicities carry strong emotional weight. People often recount moments where a coincidence arrived during a crisis, crossroads, or decision, amplifying its impact. A diary entry noting someone thought of a song before it played on the radio may feel like trivia, but a chance encounter with an old friend that leads to a life-saving opportunity is remembered as pivotal. Respondents often emphasize that what elevates a coincidence into synchronicity is not improbability alone, but relevance to their immediate struggles or hopes. If a coincidence provides clarity, comfort, or confirmation, it tends to be inscribed in memory as significant. Researchers also notice age and life stage patterns. Older participants, having accumulated more memories, report more synchronicities, not necessarily because such events occur more often, but because their life stories contain rich threads for coincidences to latch onto. They are more likely to connect a present event to past choices, relationships, or generational lines. Younger groups do experience synchronicities, but they often describe them through metaphors resonating with technology and digital systems. These parallels reveal that synchronicity adapts not just to regional traditions, but also to generational frameworks. Another critical finding is selectivity. Not every coincidence counts as synchronicity to its witness. Many participants distinguished between noticing and valuing. A near miss on timing may be forgotten, while a message, face, or number that touches a meaningful theme is remembered vividly. This threshold depends on psychological and situational factors. For example, if someone is grieving, even a small coincidence related to the lost person may feel magnified. Cognitive science reinforces this. Attention and meaning-making often fuse when emotions or personal relevance are high, creating memories of synchronicities that stand apart from the noise of daily events. Across all these studies, the conclusion grows increasingly clear. Synchronicities are not statistical outliers observed only by a mystical few. Instead, they appear as recurring features of everyday perception, molded by cultural, emotional, and cognitive frames. Experiences of meaningful coincidence resemble a universal cognitive template, filled differently depending on upbringing, worldview, and current concerns. Any attempt to reduce such events to one explanation, be it divine intervention or pure chance, misses the layered complexity that global data now reveals. This universality does not flatten the differences, though. The same type of coincidence can live very different lives depending on which interpretive ecosystem it lands in. A sudden encounter may feel like divine destiny in one culture, psychological pattern seeking in another, or a design glitch in yet another. And yet, at the structural level, the shape holds constant, an improbable overlap, a personal connection, a lasting emotional trace. That resilience keeps synchronicity relevant across traditions and centuries. As the numbers accumulate, synchronicity research shifts the question from "does it happen?" to what drives people to notice and interpret it this way. This shift opens the door for the sciences of attention, memory, and pattern recognition to enter. Modern tools of cognitive psychology are now positioned to explain the mechanics behind why the same coincidence leaps out as extraordinary to one person, yet vanishes as background to another. And this is where new research turns. Because if meaningful coincidences are part of almost everyone's lived experience, the next logical step is to ask what role the brain itself plays in producing them, not just noticing, but perhaps also shaping what gets noticed. To understand that, we have to look more closely at the machinery of attention that governs what reality actually reaches awareness. The brain's pattern-seeking machine. Your brain is built for one purpose above many others: finding patterns in the chaos around you. Every moment, countless signals flow toward your senses: sounds, sights, textures, shifts in light and movement. If your mind admitted all of it into conscious thought, the effect would be impossible to manage. What makes ordinary life workable is that your nervous system runs a constant selection process, deciding which fragments of incoming data are admitted into awareness and which pass by unnoticed. At the center of this system is the Reticular Activating System, or RAS. Located in the brainstem, the RAS is a network of nuclei that regulates arousal, attention, and prioritization of sensory input. Its role is well documented. It acts as a functional gatekeeper between the overwhelming outside world and the narrow spotlight of perception. When people describe the RAS as a spotlight operator in a theater, the metaphor holds real weight. Imagine a crowded stage, full of props and performers. Everything is technically visible, but you cannot focus until the operator swings the beam across the scene. The RAS plays this part in your daily life, deciding what deserves illumination and what slips back into the dark. Neuroscience has shown that this modulation relies on neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, serotonin, histamine, and acetylcholine, which alter the sensitivity of this system depending on context and need. In effect, these neurochemical adjustments determine which stimuli will stand out to you, whether it is the sound of your name at a noisy party or the cry of your baby in the middle of the night. The selectivity of the RAS means that relevance is not simply found, it is internally defined. If you recently searched for a job, chance encounters with help-wanted signs suddenly leap into view. If you are expecting a child, conversations about strollers seem to echo around you. Nothing in the environment has inherently intensified. Instead, the spotlight has shifted, giving priority to signals that match your personal goals or emotional focus. This process is automatic, but what it filters often feels quite intentional. A common example helps reveal this mechanism. Consider the moment after purchasing a new car, perhaps a bright red model. Almost immediately, you begin spotting identical vehicles on the road as if the world had suddenly filled with them. Statistically, nothing has changed. What has shifted is how your brain processes the presence of those cars. Since the new purchase makes them relevant, the RAS amplifies them in your perceptual field. In psychology, this is sometimes labeled the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, or frequency illusion. While some interpret it as uncanny or even synchronistic, the underlying process is your attentional system teaching you what to see. Linking this back to synchronicity is straightforward. If the RAS selects which elements of reality enter conscious awareness, then meaningful coincidences, at least in part, may originate from this filtering. Someone anxious over finances might notice repeated references to money, articles, overheard conversations, sudden reminders of expenses. Another person preoccupied with relationships will more readily notice timing delays, unexpected encounters, or symbolic gestures tied to intimacy. From this perspective, synchronicities are not necessarily objective shifts in the external world. Instead, they reflect how attention moves toward information already present, producing the feeling that out there is aligning with in here. Importantly, the RAS is not simply an abstract psychological theory. Anatomically, it includes structures such as the locus coeruleus, raphe nuclei, tuberomammillary nucleus, and pedunculopontine tegmentum. Together, these regulate alertness and determine how stimuli are prioritized or ignored. This is why a parent can sleep through thunder, but wake instantly to the specific cry of their infant. The filter recognizes relevance long before conscious thought intervenes. By identifying and tagging cues linked to survival, goals, or emotional investment, the RAS turns raw sensory input into organized perception. The effect of this mechanism can be double-edged. On one side, it can serve human goals with remarkable efficiency. If you commit yourself to marathon training, your awareness tilts toward health-related cues: running shoes in shop windows, articles about hydration, new possible training routes. Each coincidence feels encouraging, as though surrounding reality were cooperating with your ambition. On the other side, the same system can trap individuals in cycles of fear or paranoia. If fear is the defining state, the RAS highlights potential threats, linking events that are otherwise separate. For someone in such a mindset, minor coincidences transform into seemingly hostile signs of persecution. The structure is the same: but the emotional content drastically alters the experience. Another reason coincidences feel striking is that the RAS links selectivity with emotional intensity. When the system flags information, it often does so because of personal value, not just novelty. That means attention is almost always entangled with effect. Strong emotion reinforces perception, and in this way a trivial overlap can escalate into something memorable. Perhaps you doubt a purchase decision, and then, by chance, see someone wearing the same item. That alignment feels reassuring, evidence provided by the world itself. Had you felt indifferent, the sight may have passed unregistered. The brain, through its filtering, introduces significance where raw probability alone does not. Still, while the RAS provides a convincing mechanism for how coincidences rise into awareness, it does not dictate how meaning attaches to them. That distinction matters. Neuroscience can describe how selective attention operates, but it does not by itself determine why one person treats a coincidence as profound while another dismisses it as trivial. The filter explains the noticing, not the interpretation. This boundary leaves room for debate. Some argue that synchronicity is simply perceptual bias layered upon chance, while others maintain that consciousness brings forward patterns just when they become most relevant. In either view, the RAS creates the conditions by which coincidences can accumulate personal weight. What is unambiguous is that the human brain is tuned toward order. From random noise, it extracts usable signs, draws lines between events, and constructs narratives that make the vast sequence of impressions manageable. To an individual, this process often resembles correspondence between thought and reality. To a researcher, it looks like cognitive economy, an architecture shaped to cut a livable path through chaos. Both interpretations fit, and both highlight the same fact. The noticing of coincidence is inseparable from the machinery that manages attention. Yet this same machinery sets the stage for a deeper problem. If coincidences emerge partly from how awareness is filtered, then how do we separate valid recognition of meaningful alignment from false patterns invented by the mind? The RAS explains why certain things appear to stand out, but it does not tell us whether those things truly align or whether our perception simply insists they do. The tension between actual connection and imagined structure becomes the next challenge. And it is here we must confront the possibility that what feels like cosmic design may instead be the brain's own tendency to impose meaning on chance. Apophenia and confirmation bias. Are coincidences showing us hidden alignments, or are they simply byproducts of how the brain processes chance? This question brings us directly to two key psychological tendencies, apophenia and confirmation bias. Both offer well-studied explanations for why people so often perceive synchronicities, and both highlight how deeply our perception can shape what we call reality. Apophenia refers to the tendency to perceive meaningful connections among unrelated or random phenomena. It includes experiences like pareidolia, where we see faces in clouds or human features in inanimate objects, and the clustering illusion, where random distributions appear to form patterns. Evolutionary psychology suggests this bias once served a survival function. For early humans, mistaking wind in the grass as a predator was safer than failing to notice an actual danger. Natural selection favored pattern detection, even if it created false positives. The legacy is a brain that constantly seeks order, often preferring illusory meaning over no meaning at all. This process extends far beyond visual illusions. In daily life, apophenia shows up as clusters of coincidences that seem too pointed to ignore. Suppose you run into several people from the same hometown in a short span of time. Statistically, this clustering may not be unusual, but your mind highlights the repetition and imbues it with symbolic weight, perhaps convincing you that the universe is nudging you toward that place. What stands out is not the objective rarity of the event, but the sense of personal resonance that comes from it. The feeling is genuine, even if the cause is cognitive bias. Alongside this, confirmation bias powerfully shapes how synchronicities are stored and recalled. Confirmation bias is the tendency to notice and remember evidence that supports pre-existing beliefs while disregarding what contradicts them. If you believe that a certain number follows you, you will register it on clocks, receipts, or license plates, while the countless moments when other numbers appear fade from memory. Over time, selective attention builds a convincing narrative that the number is chasing you. The same process operates if you believe you are unlucky. You will notice delays, mishaps, and frustrations, reinforcing the sense of a pattern, while overlooking the moments when things went smoothly. The two biases often reinforce each other. Apophenia generates the initial perception of a connection, a repeating number, a stranger who says exactly what you were just thinking, and confirmation bias strengthens that perception by focusing memory and interpretation in ways that fortify the apparent pattern. The result is a feedback loop where belief sharpens perception, and perception reinforces belief. It can feel as if the external world is responding directly to your inner state, when in fact your cognitive filters are curating the inputs you notice and preserve. One vivid example comes from gambling research. Slot machines, in particular, exploit apophenia and confirmation bias through near-miss designs. Three similar symbols appear almost aligned, giving the impression of being close to victory. Statistically, players were never closer to winning than at any other spin, but the near pattern tricks the brain's pattern recognition system. Confirmation bias then heightens the effect by making wins and near wins highly memorable, while letting countless losses vanish into the background. Behavioral studies back this up. Near misses activate reward circuits, even though no actual win has occurred. The mechanism is powerful enough that it sustains behavior long after rational evaluation would insist it is pointless. But these biases are not confined to casinos. Consider someone who sees repeated animal encounters as meaningful messages. A crow lands on their porch day after day, and soon the bird takes on symbolic significance, a sign, a warning, or an affirmation. Objectively, if crows are common in the area, their presence is expected. Yet apophenia elevates the coincidence, while confirmation bias ensures that every additional crow sighting becomes validation of the message. Patterns confirm themselves, and ordinary events transform into signs tailored to the observer's life. The interplay of these mechanisms helps explain why so many synchronicity accounts remain convincing even in the face of skeptical explanations. The perception of personal meaning is what gives these events their impact. Even if apophenia generates the connection and confirmation bias preserves it, the emotional experience of the universe speaking remains real for the person who lives through it. This does not mean the perception reflects external order, but it does mean the consequences can be substantial, guiding choices, lifting moods, or reinforcing personal narratives. It is worth noting that these traits are not always negative. Research has found that people more prone to noticing synchronicities often score high on measures of creativity and imagination. This tendency to detect unexpected links mirrors what fuels inventive thinking, the ability to connect disparate ideas into a novel whole. At the same time, studies also link synchronicity proneness with certain vulnerabilities, including mood disturbances and depressive symptoms. Psychologists describe this as a double-edged trait. The mind that connects random dots into inspiring insights can, under strain, also connect them into troubling or distorted narratives. The same sensitivity that fuels creativity may enhance well-being in one moment while heightening risk in another. Because of this duality, synchronicity experiences sit in an ambiguous space between adaptive and maladaptive cognition. On one hand, they provide memorable turning points, comfort in hard times, and creative breakthroughs. On the other, they may intensify distorted thinking when interpreted through a lens of paranoia or despair. This complexity explains why synchronicity continues to captivate both psychologists and the public. It illustrates how the same underlying mechanisms, apophenia, pareidolia, clustering illusions, and confirmation bias, can produce experiences that range from inspiring to destabilizing. Even with this understanding, knowing about these biases does not erase their pull. You might learn that apophenia predisposes you to see faces in tree bark or detect patterns in coincidental numbers, and yet you still feel a rush of recognition when life presents such an alignment. You might read about confirmation bias, and yet the next moment your lucky number appears, you feel its significance immediately. Rational explanation and emotional conviction coexist without canceling each other out. For many, the story that a coincidence feels personally fated is harder to shake than the statistics that explain it away. What's crucial here is that calling these experiences illusions does not strip them of psychological power. If a synchronicity gives hope to someone in grief, supports a difficult decision, or provides encouragement at a turning point, then it has real effects, regardless of whether the link was objectively meaningful or a cognitive byproduct. The outcome, comfort, courage, or clarity, matters to the person more than the mechanics behind it. This is why the debate around synchronicity is unlikely to close anytime soon. We know much about how the brain constructs meaning from randomness, and yet the feelings these experiences evoke carry weight in people's lives. That tension sustains conversation between psychology, philosophy, and even fields far outside of mind sciences. For some, these cognitive explanations settle the matter. For others, they only highlight the profound capacity of human consciousness to shape reality as we experience it. Which raises a deeper question. If the brain's biases can generate powerful experiences of pattern and meaning, what does it suggest about the role of consciousness itself in shaping reality? This takes us from the realm of psychology into another domain where the rules of order and observation become even stranger, and the question is no longer just about tricks of the mind, but about the very structure of nature itself. Quantum physics and consciousness. Quantum physics has long raised questions that sound uncomfortably close to philosophy, and one of the most pressing is whether consciousness plays any role in shaping reality. For years, most scientists brushed this aside as speculation, but the topic continues to resurface, partly because experiments at the quantum level defy common sense. What makes this relevant to synchronicity is the possibility, however remote, that mind and matter might not be entirely separate. The puzzle is whether an act of observation simply registers reality or, in some interpretations, helps decide what comes into being. This is usually framed in terms of the so-called observer effect. In quantum mechanics, particles remain suspended in overlapping states until measured, when they are forced into definite outcomes. The question is whether measurement requires a conscious observer, or if the effect can be explained by something else entirely, such as physical interaction with a detector or environmental noise, a process called decoherence. Some researchers explore the idea that attention itself might collapse possibilities into facts, but the majority of physicists remain skeptical, emphasizing that the evidence can be interpreted without placing consciousness at the center. The debate remains unsettled, and most experts caution that experiments so far reveal anomalies in measurement, not proof of mind-to-matter causation. Newer studies revisit these questions with refined experiments, including updated versions of the double-slit test. Some teams propose ways to isolate whether awareness directly influences quantum outcomes. Advocates argue this would position consciousness as a fundamental element of physical law, not a late byproduct of evolution. Critics reply that the subtle effects detected are far more likely explained by interference, noise, and the fragile nature of quantum states. In other words, when particles act unpredictably, the system itself is sensitive, not necessarily responsive to thought. While experiments continue, caution is the rule. There is interest in whether consciousness and quantum mechanics interact, but no accepted data confirms that human awareness changes physical events outside the mind. One area that often enters these conversations is entanglement. When two particles interact and become entangled, their properties remain linked even at great distance. If one is measured, the other responds instantly, a phenomenon Einstein dismissed as spooky action at a distance. Entanglement today is no longer in dispute. It has been validated repeatedly and is even used in developing secure communication methods. But it is important to underline that entanglement describes consistent correlations between particles, not symbolic meaning, and certainly not psychic connection. For people reflecting on synchronicity, entanglement is often cited as a metaphor. If nature tolerates non-local links at the smallest scales, perhaps our odd experiences of connection feel less implausible. But the physics itself does not extend to validating personal coincidence stories. The resemblance is conceptual, not evidential. That distinction is critical. Entanglement demonstrates that reality operates in ways our intuition does not expect, but it does not show that two friends thinking of each other at the same time are quantumly connected. What can be said is that both domains highlight gaps in classical reasoning. In one case, we have physical data demonstrating non-local effects. In the other, we have psychological experiences interpreted as meaningful coincidence. Drawing them together is more a matter of analogy than direct science. Meanwhile, some theorists explore wider frameworks linking consciousness and physics. Panpsychism, the view that consciousness pervades all matter, has been revisited with modern philosophical tools, while approaches like integrated information theory propose that consciousness corresponds to the amount of information integrated by a system. Certain physicists speculate these frameworks could connect with quantum principles, though again, this is controversial. Most neuroscientists and physicists resist any suggestion that laboratory anomalies justify attributing physical power to conscious thought. The dominant view is that consciousness remains poorly understood, but it does not rewrite quantum mechanics. That said, fringe avenues do gain attention. An example includes research probing whether anesthetics like xenon affect microtubules in neurons in ways tied to quantum coherence. Some interpret this as evidence that consciousness draws from quantum processes inside the brain. Yet this line of work is contested, with critics noting that the data are preliminary and far from conclusive. Studies remain ongoing, but no consensus has been reached. If mentioned at all, such models must be treated as speculative, highlighting curiosity rather than confirmation. For people experiencing synchronicities, the fine distinctions between decoherence, measurement, and entanglement may matter less than the impression they give. The impression is that reality is not purely mechanical, that something about attention, awareness, or connection unsettles familiar rules. Science does not endorse the idea that thought makes coincidences happen, but science does acknowledge that at the smallest scales, reality is profoundly unfamiliar. That recognition alone encourages parallels in the wider culture, where people reflect on meaning, pattern, and alignment. Still, misunderstandings are common. The leap from saying consciousness could be involved in measuring quantum states to consciousness directly shapes everyday events is vast and unproven. Physics explains behavior at very small scales, while our lived coincidences happen in the macroscopic world. Bridging that gap is far from straightforward. Caution from experts is uniform. Speculative links may be intriguing, but they should not be overstated. Where synchronicity relies on personal interpretation, quantum mechanics relies on reproducible measurement, and the two converge only in metaphor. This tension creates a paradox. On one side, physics demonstrates realities more bizarre than intuition allows. On the other, stories of coincidence feel so pointed they are difficult to dismiss. One domain gathers data and equations, the other collects private testimonies. The connection is not in evidence, but in atmosphere. Both leave us confronting a world that resists the assumption of simplicity. To many, that atmosphere is enough to justify curiosity, even wonder. The cultural effect is undeniable. The fact that consciousness is even discussed in physics, however cautiously, opens a space for dialogue where psychology, philosophy, and science intersect. Where once scientists treated the mind as irrelevant to physical law, some now admit it may play a role worth investigating, if nothing else to better define its boundaries. And for people navigating their own synchronicities, this openness lends permission. If nature itself eludes straight lines, perhaps personal experiences of hidden connection should not be dismissed outright either. Ultimately, what these debates reveal is not confirmation that synchronicity and quantum physics share a mechanism, but recognition that both challenge the tidy certainty of classical explanation. At everyday scales, we live mostly in probability and perception, while at quantum scales particles obey rules that unsettle cause and effect. Both domains remind us that our frameworks for understanding reality are incomplete. And when reality itself operates with such unpredictability, it is no surprise that events in ordinary life can feel improbable to the point of impossible. That sense of improbability, especially when lived from the inside, is where the conversation next turns. When probability feels impossible, probability becomes especially intriguing when events appear far too precise to be random. From a statistical point of view, many of these so-called impossibilities are not only possible, but unavoidable once you account for scale. The larger the system, millions of thoughts, conversations, encounters, and choices over time, the more certain it becomes that some of these alignments will feel extraordinary. The classic example is the birthday paradox. In a group of just 23 people, the odds that two share the same birthday are already greater than 50%. Intuition tells us those odds should be much lower, because we tend to calculate against a fixed set of 365 days. What we overlook is that probability expands as every person can match with every other person. The number of possible pairings grows so quickly that at even modest group sizes, the unlikely becomes expected. A statistician looks at this and sees predictability. A participant living through it feels surprise, sometimes bordering on disbelief. This paradox points toward what mathematicians call the law of truly large numbers. It suggests that if you observe enough instances, even the strangest coincidences are guaranteed to show up. In a city teeming with millions of people, or across decades of daily experiences, low probability alignments will emerge regularly. Winning a lottery, running into an old friend miles from where you first met, or hearing the same song repeat at meaningful times can all be explained as inevitable in a system with countless moving parts. From the outside, there is no mystery. But from within, when it happens directly to you, the effect resonates far beyond arithmetic. Research adds even more depth to this story of inevitability versus experience. In a recent reanalysis of daily diaries, psychologist Rominger and colleagues found that coincidences occur far more frequently than people imagine. Participants often recorded at least one meaningful coincidence on ordinary days, and those who reported positive emotional states were especially likely to notice them again the following day. In other words, not only do improbable events emerge constantly in human lives, but the likelihood of perceiving them is shaped by current mood and context. This intertwining of probability and psychology explains why synchronicity often feels like more than simple chance. Consider a more illustrative scenario. Imagine you step onto a train in another country and find yourself seated near someone who once lived on your childhood street. Statistically, in a world of billions constantly in motion, such an encounter is not truly impossible. Enough journeys, enough people, enough overlaps, and eventually, these meetings take place. But when it's you making eye contact with that former neighbor across borders and years, the math no longer feels satisfying. The improbable event becomes your personal story, charged with weight far beyond calculation, like the universe carving out a narrative moment tailored to your life. This interior perspective explains why probability alone cannot dissolve the sensation of synchronicity. Probability describes how often coincidences emerge across populations. Consciousness translates that event into meaning for an individual. The contrast is stark. A statistician sees inevitability. A person living through it sees significance. Probability points outward, reality happening at immense scales. Synchronicity points inward, reality filtered through the feeling of resonance. The statistics explain the occurrence. What they do not explain is the impact. This divide surfaces in everything from trivial occurrences to life-defining events. Take lotteries as an example. Millions of players purchase tickets despite knowing their odds of winning are almost non-existent. Mathematically, someone has to win, and eventually someone always does. The inevitability of a winner is not miraculous, it's written into the design. Yet for the actual winner holding the ticket, the experience feels staggeringly improbable, like lightning choosing them alone. The law of large numbers frames it as arithmetic. Lived perspective frames it as destiny. Both are valid within their own frame of reference, but they explain different parts of the experience. The same tension shows up in smaller, overlooked ways. Think of noticing the same number repeatedly, on a receipt, on a clock, on a passing street sign. To a mathematician, the millions of numbers you encounter daily make repetition guaranteed eventually. To you, in that moment of recognition, the repetition feels weighted with deeper significance. The fact that countless other sequences passed by unnoticed does not take away from the personal impact when alignment does strike. Awareness singles it out, and memory makes it linger. Humans are not well equipped to intuit probability, but we are well equipped to tell stories. Psychological research shows over and over that the mind privileges narrative over calculation. Coincidences naturally insert themselves into this structure like unexpected plot twists. They feel authored, as though external reality is deliberately engaging with the rhythms of your inner life. The contrast is not solved through education. Even those who understand the math still describe awe at being inside the experience. Knowledge that this was bound to happen to someone does little to mute the conviction of, but it happened to me. This misalignment between numbers and narratives reinforces why synchronicity remains so compelling. Cold probability proves that no event is too far-fetched once scaled across enough opportunities. But the personal shock of the improbable reshapes the event into memory, story, and meaning. One perspective treats coincidence as noise, the other treats it as signal. More often than not, people lean on the signal because that is the one they feel firsthand. The implication is that while statistics can contextualize coincidence, they cannot neutralize its sting or charm. They account for distribution, but not for meaning. That unresolved gap leaves many people wondering whether probability tells the whole story. Some remain content with the idea that nothing uncanny occurs, that improbabilities, like shared birthdays in a crowded room, emerge because mathematics demands they must. Others insist that the number of such experiences in their own lives strains the probabilities to breaking. That calculation misses something essential about why coincidences happen when they do. This tension explains why coincidences remain open to so many interpretations. For one audience, they are teaching examples of probability's deceptive nature. For another, they are reminders of how reality sometimes appears infused with pattern or design. Both responses may exist simultaneously, even within the same person, moments of skepticism alternating with moments of awe. That oscillation keeps synchronicity alive, not as a solved question, but as an ongoing negotiation between mind, math, and meaning. At its core, the experience of improbable coincidence highlights the difference between an event's objective frequency and its subjective force. Numbers cover one dimension. Human participation fills in the other. And it is precisely because humans feel those improbable alignments in such visceral ways that synchronicity remains a phenomenon not explained away by probability alone. The next dimension of the puzzle emerges when we step outside individual perception and ask how societies frame these events collectively. Because while the mathematics of large numbers is universal, the meaning assigned to coincidences differs drastically depending on cultural background, tradition, and belief systems. Cultural codes of meaning. Across societies, reports of striking coincidences do not vanish, but the frameworks that shape their meaning are remarkably different. What one observer dismisses as chance, another may treat as a sign rooted in cultural context. This is where cultural codes of meaning come into focus. They do not change the event itself, but they strongly guide how it is recognized, valued, and remembered. Ethnographic accounts show that in some indigenous traditions, the world is not divided into mere accidents and real intentions. Instead, events that align with personal or communal concerns are regarded as part of an interconnected field of meaning. Aboriginal Australian stories, for example, include narratives where meaningful but non-causal events are taken seriously as signs of relationship between people, land, and spirit. In these contexts, synchronicity is not an anomaly, but an affirmation that perception is woven into the living environment. Rather than viewing coincidence as a disruption of order, it is treated as reinforcement of existing patterns. Philosophical traditions in Asia provide another way of understanding coincidences without needing to frame them as supernatural. In certain Taoist-influenced perspectives, events that align are seen as natural harmonies, moments when life is in tune with an underlying balance. Instead of emphasizing intervention by a force outside nature, these coincidences are folded into a worldview that already assumes interconnection. Within this philosophy, synchronicity offers verification that human lives flow alongside larger processes, not apart from them. Religious traditions globally also provide fertile ground for interpreting coincidences. Within Christianity and Islam, for instance, unusual but timely encounters are often explained as signs of divine presence or orchestration. When two paths cross under improbable circumstances, believers may point to God's will or providence. This framing matters because it reinforces both faith and trust in a higher plan. Rather than feeling like accidents, coincidences are treated as reassurance that guidance is present. Such interpretations influence how people weigh decisions, especially at moments of uncertainty. At the same time, secular frameworks reinterpret synchronicity through other lenses. In technologically saturated societies, coincidences are sometimes explained as glitches in the matrix, a metaphor borrowed from digital culture. Here, strange alignments become evidence of hidden architecture, not divine will. These interpretations are not supported by formal science, but they resonate because they offer a language of meaning adapted to computational thinking. Younger generations especially may gravitate toward simulation metaphors, while others describe coincidences as evidence of manifestation or the law of attraction. What unites them is the insistence that synchronicity matters, even if the reasoning shifts with worldview. An important insight from current research is that cultural systems do not only guide how coincidences are explained, they also influence which events are considered meaningful in the first place. The SEMD model, synchronicity awareness versus synchronicity meaning detection, helps articulate this difference. While awareness of patterns may be fairly universal, the assignment of meaning is filtered through local expectations. In settings that value spiritual or mystical interpretation, even modest repetitions may qualify as meaningful. In contrast, in secular or skeptical environments, only extreme or improbable coincidences are treated as worthy of attention. This explains why survey data often show variation in synchronicity reporting between cultural contexts, even when the base rate of chance events remains constant. Cultural codes also shape the consequences of synchronicity. For some, a coincidence becomes personal motivation, a story shared with friends, but not necessarily something that changes life direction. In other societies, meaningful coincidences may carry communal consequences. A dream symbol that aligns with subsequent events might be taken to elders for discussion, and its meaning weighed collectively. This practice makes synchronicity not simply an individual experience, but a shared interpretive act. Coincidences, in these cultural frameworks, can guide choices affecting families or communities, not just individuals. The line between personal and collective meaning remains sharp. In much of the West, coincidence narratives highlight individuality. The universe spoke to me. But cross-cultural research shows that elsewhere, synchronicity is not just private but social, confirming bonds, affirming identity within tradition, or guiding the group as a whole. In these contexts, synchronicity becomes a form of cultural communication, ensuring that chance events are not left to randomness, but integrated into a fabric of significance. Another dimension to consider is how cultural codes preserve synchronicity in the arts and creative practice. Contemporary research in arts-based fields shows that many artists integrate coincidence into their process, treating unexpected alignments as openings for insight. This echoes historical traditions where creativity itself was seen as inspired, not purely self-generated. The LABRC conference materials highlight that synchronicity has been used as an epistemic tool across cultures, providing ways of knowing that bypass strict cause and effect reasoning. Meaning emerges not just in religious or communal interpretation, but also in creative labor, where coincidences function as inspiration points. These frameworks reveal why synchronicity is not reducible to probability alone. Mathematical explanation can show why coincidences must occur, but cultural systems assign them weight. The same event, a repeated number, an unexpected encounter, is invisible in one setting and profound in another. Interpretation is not arbitrary. It grows out of shared worldviews that teach individuals what counts as meaningful and how to respond. This recognition underscores that synchronicity is not simply a private illusion, but a socially constructed practice layered onto universal experiences of chance. It also explains why global surveys detect variance, not only in frequency of synchronicity reports, but also in emotional impact. For some, synchronicities inspire reflection on personal growth. For others, they renew confidence in spiritual order or affirm ancestral ties. Importantly, these interpretations are not interchangeable. Each reflects the symbolic system already active within the culture. Across traditions, be they indigenous cosmologies, religious traditions, or secular philosophies, synchronicity is absorbed into the structures already shaping meaning in daily life. Comparison highlights differences vividly. Two individuals may describe the same coincidence with entirely distinct interpretations: divine sign, philosophical harmony, psychological bias, or digital glitch. The factual overlap does not change, but its significance diverges completely. This variation underscores that synchronicity is not merely a phenomenon of perception, it is also a product of cultural context. What feels ordinary to one may be transformative to another. Because of this, synchronicity remains a valuable tool for studying how meaning itself is constructed. It reveals the interaction between personal psychology and collective expectation, demonstrating that perception alone cannot account for the differences. Instead, culture supplies the symbolic codes that turn chance into narrative. Without those codes, coincidences might pass unnoticed. With them, coincidences become infused with significance powerful enough to alter belief, choice, and even identity. Recognizing these cultural dimensions does not solve the underlying debate about synchronicity's ultimate source, but it shows that coincidences cannot be separated from the systems of meaning that frame them. Whether explained as fate, harmony, glitch, or manifestation, the practical effect is the same. Synchronicities orient people within their cultural and personal worlds. They are interpreted through the lenses that foreground what matters, reinforcing values and shaping responses. This orientation matters most at moments of strain, where coincidence provides not just intellectual curiosity, but emotional grounding. In those contexts, synchronicity moves from cultural symbol into lived support, offering a sense of guidance when ordinary order feels absent. It is often in these fragile settings, when life feels most unstable, that synchronicity delivers its greatest impact. Synchronicities in mental health and well-being. Synchronicities often take on special importance in conversations about mental health and well-being, where meaning itself becomes a central tool for resilience. For some individuals, coincidences arrive during emotional strain and feel like signals of reassurance. A grieving person might unexpectedly hear a song that evokes the memory of a lost loved one. Someone battling isolation might notice a recurring symbol that seems to echo their inner state. These moments, while arising from chance, can function like stabilizing anchors. The very act of paying attention and finding structure in an otherwise unpredictable moment provides orientation in times of turmoil. Clinicians working in recent years have recognized this pattern. Research consistently shows that recovery from stress or trauma is tied to the ability to create personal meaning. In this context, synchronicities act as raw material for meaning-making. A chance encounter, a repeated phrase, or a pattern in numbers does not alter reality's mechanics, but its interpretation can redirect focus. Therapists in 2024 and 2025 have reported cases where clients described coincidences as affirmations of progress or symbols of hope, even when no causal explanation existed. Instead of debating whether the coincidence was real in an external sense, therapists worked with patients on how the perception itself could be harnessed for healing. Here, the Synchronicity Awareness and Meaning Detection (SEMD) framework has special value. Recent studies by Russo-Netzer and Isaacson found that individuals who not only notice coincidences, but also interpret them as significant report higher well-being. Awareness alone does not predict much, but when awareness is paired with meaning detection, when people connect events to personal growth or goals, it tends to correlate with greater life satisfaction and higher optimism. Clinicians interpret this to mean that synchronicities can help mental health most effectively when framed as prompts for meaning, not directives. In practice, a coincidence about money can be used to reflect on financial anxieties, or an overheard phrase can point to themes the client may be struggling to articulate. Used this way, synchronicities become conversational entry points into deeper issues. This effect shows up in trauma therapy. Survivors often describe their memories and emotions as chaotic, with life events stripped of order. Coincidences, however small, can insert a structure that feels grounding. For example, encountering a familiar name at the same time as a turning point in therapy session may reinforce the perception that recovery is purposeful. Clinicians stress that the power of such moments lies in their metaphorical impact. They are not proof of hidden universal design. Rather, they function psychologically by calming the nervous system and providing a sense of continuity. The perceived alignment, whether trivial or striking, offers coherence where disorder once dominated. For those facing prolonged indecision, synchronicities can reduce paralysis. Imagine weighing whether to make a major life change, only to have reinforcing coincidences appear. A conversation overheard about the city you are considering moving to, a job posting that arrives the same day. Even when these events are statistically ordinary, patients often describe them as decisive. Clinicians note that the benefit lies not in literal direction from outside forces, but in the way patients interpret the overlap as confirmation. That interpretation often reduces anxiety, narrows uncertainty, and makes choosing possible. In therapeutic settings, this forward motion itself matters, since stagnation often entrenches distress. Interestingly, synchronicities seem to bolster a blend of agency and fate. Research in 2025 highlighted that clients who perceive coincidences frequently report a paradoxical sense of both guidance and empowerment. Believing a coincidence validates a choice makes that choice feel less risky, while believing one had the awareness to notice the sign reinforces self-confidence. Together, these feelings enhance agency while lowering doubt. For those who struggle with low control or fear of making mistakes, this mixture is stabilizing, even if the coincidence itself has no objective directive power. Another recurring benefit arises in connection to loneliness. When coincidences feel tuned to personal states, they create the impression of connection with something larger, be it the world, destiny, or even simply reality noticing. While skeptics may insist the process is random, therapists observe that this sense of reciprocity reduces feelings of abandonment. Some clients describe synchronicities as being in conversation with life. The framing matters less than the effect: reduced isolation, strengthened endurance, and greater openness to support. Personal storytelling is also central here. Humans are natural narrators, and synchronicities fit easily into emerging life stories. Patients who reinterpret coincidences as evidence of progress tend to look back on their recovery with a sense of coherence. Events line up retrospectively in a pattern, transforming suffering into a story with arcs and turning points. Clinical research suggests this kind of narrative coherence strengthens resilience by giving people a reason to situate pain within a broader trajectory of growth. A coincidence reframed as part of that plotline becomes a symbolic milestone, not just an interruption. At the same time, caution is required. Clinicians recognize clear risks when synchronicity is interpreted too literally. Some patients may begin scanning relentlessly for new signs, turning every detail into potential instruction. Over time, this can become compulsive pattern seeking, reinforcing anxiety rather than easing it. Observations from Psychology Today reviews noted that synchronicity awareness has also been connected, in some samples, to higher depressive symptoms. Researchers stress that therapeutic use must monitor for these dark sides. The same sensitivity that inspires creativity and reflection can also amplify distress under certain conditions. Awareness without balance may lead to overinterpretation, rumination, or paranoia. Therapists therefore emphasize careful framing. Synchronicities should be introduced as prompts for reflection or dialogue, not prescriptions dictating behavior. Many professionals recommend structured practices to achieve this safely, such as journaling. By writing down coincidences and then analyzing them over time, clients shift from compulsive seeking to pattern reflection. Themes emerge across entries, clarifying what issues repeat beneath the surface. This method highlights values and goals while keeping coincidence interpretation grounded in self-exploration. Another therapeutic strategy uses synchronicities as stepping stones toward goal formation. A repeated theme identified through coincidences might be reframed as a clue to an unacknowledged priority. Beyond therapy, wellness communities have adopted similar techniques. Journaling and mindfulness practices encourage individuals to track coincidences in daily life as a way of clarifying inner focus. Instead of waiting passively for signs, people use these records to build awareness of recurring motifs in their decisions or struggles. The structure transforms perceived chance into structured feedback, reconnecting scattered impressions into a sense of direction. Seen in this way, coincidences become tools for organizing life around articulated goals, without drifting into superstition. Physiological benefits also surface in accounts of therapeutic synchronicity. When individuals interpret coincidental events as evidence that life has order, measurements often show reduced stress responses. Patients report lowered anxiety, calmer breathing, and improved mood following the recognition of meaningful alignment. These subjective impressions align with measurable reductions in stress hormones and arousal, creating real shifts in bodily states. The mechanism again is not external causation, but the internal reassurance that one is moving within structure rather than chaos. Coincidences, whether trivial or significant, effectively operate like mindfulness cues, reminders to perceive order and stability. Ultimately, synchronicities in mental health are not about proving hidden laws of nature. They are about illustrating how humans use coincidence as scaffolding for survival and growth. A well-timed alignment provides comfort, fuels reflection, or offers courage when choices seem too heavy. Even stripped of metaphysical claims, the psychological effects are tangible: reduced anxiety, stronger resilience, and renewed perspective. Practitioners point out that this does not mean interpreting every event as cosmically planned. It means treating such experiences as mental anchors that can help steady the mind. This balance, between helpful interpretation and limiting overreach, runs like a thread through the clinical literature of 2024 and 2025. Used carefully, synchronicities can serve as conversation starters, therapeutic tools, or journaling prompts. Used uncritically, they can deepen distress. That duality reflects the broader question still lingering about synchronicity. Does it reveal order in the world, or only in the way we decide to see it? The therapeutic answer remains pragmatic. Significance lies in the effect, not the cause. Yet outside clinical walls, attitudes toward synchronicity differ sharply. Some regard meaningful coincidences as essential clues pointing to hidden design, while others dismiss them as ordinary noise filtered by human bias. That opposition creates tension, and it frames the larger debate still unfolding over what synchronicities really represent. The skeptic versus believer debate. The divide between skeptics and believers often appears clear-cut, but once examined carefully, it is anything but simple. At its core, the skeptic versus believer debate asks a single question: Are synchronicities meaningful windows into hidden order, or are they tricks of attention, memory, and probability? Both camps marshal arguments that seem convincing, yet each leaves behind gaps that keep the conversation unsettled. On the skeptical side, the foundation is straightforward. Coincidences are random events inflated by human psychology. Statistically unlikely overlaps become inevitable when multiplied across billions of people, each with countless daily experiences. Add to this apophenia, the human tendency to see patterns in randomness, confirmation bias, and memory distortions, and skeptics argue that synchronicity reduces to perception error. Coincidences are not happening more than chance would predict. Rather, people highlight and remember them only when they feel significant, while the vast majority of unremarkable moments vanish without notice. Skeptics also draw attention to survivorship bias. People retell the rare moments when unlikely events align, but remain silent about the endless instances where nothing remarkable occurred. Consider a lucky career break that depended on an improbable chain of encounters. That story gets repeated again and again, while the 100 days when no such chain appeared fall into oblivion. This selective reporting distorts the impression of frequency, making coincidences appear more intentional than they are. Memory itself compounds the distortion. As stories are told and retold, the coincidences often take on sharper, more polished outlines than they had at first experience. Another argument centers on how poorly humans estimate probability. We are not intuitive statisticians. Mathematics often reveals that our impossible experiences are not impossible at all, but simply unexpected due to poor intuition. The birthday paradox makes this precise. With only 23 strangers in a room, there is already a greater than 50% chance to share the same birthday. People routinely underestimate how quickly probabilities accumulate across multiple opportunities. Skeptics present synchronicity in the same way. What feels staggering in the moment collapses into certainty once the scale of opportunities is considered. To them, what feels miraculous is explained by the law of truly large numbers. More formally, skeptics emphasize that empirical tools exist to test these experiences. Large-scale survey studies and diary methods, like Rominger's cross-lag diary work, which showed a person's openness to noticing coincidences on one day predicted perceived coincidences on the next, provide structured ways to distinguish bias-driven noticing from external cause. By analyzing not isolated anecdotes but data across thousands of responses, skeptics argue science can demonstrate that synchronicities result from selective awareness, not reality adjusting itself to inner states. In this view, applying rigorous statistics and methods is not dismissal, but the only legitimate way to assess what is happening. But believers resist reducing these events to psychological artifacts. They argue that synchronicities are not just unlikely overlaps, but arrive with timing too precise to dismiss. Reports often emphasize crises, turning points, or grief, moments when a meaningful alignment feels too weighted to be coincidence. For instance, a parent mourning a child might consistently perceive symbols tied directly to that child. Or someone weighing a major decision may suddenly encounter reinforcing coincidences pointing to one choice. Believers insist that the relevance, not just the improbability, makes these events distinctive. To them, probability cannot account for coincidences that arrive exactly when psychological impact is most profound. Supporters also highlight that dismissing synchronicity as illusion overlooks its concrete effects. Psychologically, the perception of alignment can be transformative. Therapists report patients who interpret coincidences as encouragement to continue recovery or as reassurance during depression. The coincidence, random or not, becomes a catalyst for meaningful shifts in outlook. Believers argue that to reduce these to mistakes of perception fails to acknowledge their function as lived experiences that tangibly alter behavior and emotion. The fact that they can reshape decisions or provide stability suggests they hold more weight than mere error. To strengthen their case, believers sometimes reach for analogies to physics or parapsychology. Some point to quantum mechanics, noting how outcomes remain indefinite until measured, or how entanglement links particles across vast distances. Parallels are drawn between such connections and psychological synchronicities, not as proof, but as metaphors suggesting that unseen bonds could be real. Others highlight controversial projects such as Princeton's Pear Lab and the Global Consciousness Project, which reported small statistical deviations when human intention or global events were measured against random number generators. Believers see these findings as hints that consciousness might exert subtle influence beyond the brain. Yet these comparisons remain highly debated. The majority of physicists and neuroscientists caution that quantum phenomena operate at scales far removed from human experience, and extending them to explain synchronicity is speculative. Likewise, results from parapsychology labs are considered intriguing but non-definitive because replication has been inconsistent. Researchers across fields repeat the principle: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Believers may draw inspiration from these parallels, but the scientific consensus emphasizes caution, stressing that subjective impact does not equate to proof of external causation. Examples of extraordinary coincidence also fuel belief. Twin studies in particular are often cited. Twins separated at birth and raised apart, yet growing up to marry partners with the same names, pursue similar careers, or even choose identical dog names. For skeptics, these stories are striking but still comprehensible once shared. Genetics, similar environments, and coincidence across large populations are accounted for. To believers, the cumulative improbability stretches explanation past plausibility. They see evidence of a hidden architecture that probability alone cannot resolve. Some attempt to bridge the divide by pointing to a middle ground. Skeptics may acknowledge that the emotional force of synchronicities cannot be denied, even if the underlying cause is random. Believers might concede that not every overlap carries equal weight, and many fall cleanly into the realm of confirmation bias. But common ground often collapses because each side operates from different priorities. Skeptics focus on external explanation, probability, bias, data. Believers emphasize inner experience, timing, resonance, transformation. One privileges mechanism, the other significance, and as long as those levels remain separate, neither side persuades the other. Rominger's findings illustrate this divide with precision. By showing that openness to noticing coincidences predicts future noticing, psychology exposes a self-reinforcing loop that explains many synchronicity reports without invoking hidden design. But those same methods cannot explain why coincidental timing feels so poignant or how it propels people to action. The believer side insists that lived impact is what matters most. For skeptics, this is precisely where bias thrives. Neither frame cancels the other. Instead, both describe parts of a reality that remains unfinished. This tension explains why the debate endures. Reduce every coincidence to statistics, and something human feels lost. The awe, the mystery, the sense of being addressed. Take every coincidence as a sign, and the world collapses into superstition. Synchronicity exists in the unsettled space between. Skeptics argue it's our brain's error detection gone astray. Believers argue it's reality showing itself in unexpected ways. The unanswered question is whether the truth lies entirely on one side, or whether both describe layers of the same phenomenon from different vantage points. What emerges is not resolution, but the persistence of competing frames. Skeptics present the math, believers the stories, and the conversation circles without end. But for most people, the real challenge is less about solving the metaphysics and more about knowing what to do when coincidences strike. Awareness of probability does not erase the emotional weight of lived experience. At the same time, seeing every overlap as a cosmic instruction can distort decision-making. This tension leads directly into another practical concern: what role synchronicities should play in guiding everyday choices, and how to engage with them productively without being misled. Practical navigation, using synchronicities without losing your grip. For those who pay attention to synchronicities, the next question is rarely about whether they matter. It's about how to handle them without sliding into extremes. This is where practical navigation comes in, using coincidences as tools for insight while keeping critical judgment intact. The challenge is not to silence synchronicities or to amplify them into commands, but to strike a balance where they become prompts for reflection rather than prescriptions for action. The simplest place to start is with noticing. Coincidences pass quickly if you don't record them, and memory tends to exaggerate or distort their impact. Many researchers recommend journaling as a way of capturing them in real time. A short daily log can make the process structured. Note the event, describe your state of mind or emotion just before it occurred, and mark whether the same theme repeats over days or weeks. This echoes Rominger's daily diary studies and follows the SEMD framework observed by Russo-Netzer and Isaacson. Awareness combined with meaning detection. Over time, This method shows whether what feels extraordinary is actually recurring or simply a fleeting oddity. Using this kind of log does more than archive unusual events. It separates fleeting sparks from enduring motifs. For instance, if themes about work appear across several weeks, you may realize those coincidences reflect unresolved career concerns. If nothing repeats, you may see that your impression of a pattern was stronger than the pattern itself. Journaling safeguards against selective memory, which otherwise inflates the role of a single striking event. It transforms anecdotal fragments into data, something especially useful for viewers with an analytical mindset or an interest in unexplained phenomena. Rather than treating stories of synchronicity as unverifiable, you are collecting your own dataset, evidence that reveals whether alignments cluster or fade. Tracking coincidences this way also teaches humility. When you scroll back through weeks of entries, many coincidences that once seemed overwhelming shrink in importance. They have not vanished, their weight has shifted into context. This is crucial for practical navigation because it tempers emotion with perspective. It also exposes where meaning originates, not in the coincidence itself, but in the interpretation you attach to it. By reviewing your logs, you can ask, what does this repetition say about what matters to me right now, rather than what destiny is being revealed to me. That reframing alone can turn apparent instructions into mirrors for self-exploration. Once coincidences are documented, the next step is comparison against probability. If you've written down every time a number appeared, for example, you'll notice how many numbers did not capture your attention. The appearance of 1111 may feel uncanny, but a log filled with dozens of unnoticed timestamps gives context. This method does not erase the sense of significance, but it introduces balance. It reveals not just what the mind spotlights, but also what it overlooks. That dual awareness, the meaningful few standing out against a sea of ordinary many, helps you separate what feels like a message from what may simply be attentional bias. At this point, the role of interpretation matters. Healthy engagement pivots the question away from, what is the universe telling me, toward, why did this coincidence resonate with me right now? A story about moving, echoed by conversations or repeated symbols, might highlight your own contemplation of change. A motif linked to grief may surface feelings yet to be processed. In both cases, the synchronicity helps direct awareness inward, functioning more like a psychological compass than an external directive. Therapists emphasize this as where benefits emerge. Coincidences used as prompts for reflection reinforce self-knowledge, while coincidences used as commands risk surrendering judgment to randomness. Dialogue can extend these benefits further. Keeping synchronicities private makes them prone to inflation, where every event expands in importance. Sharing with trusted friends, or even in therapy, introduces external feedback. Someone outside your perspective can test whether the coincidence aligns with anything substantive. They may recognize it as simple chance, which lightens its weight, or connect it back to themes you've been speaking about, which sharpens its usefulness. Dialogue ensures that meaning is co-constructed rather than left unchecked, decreasing the chance of spiraling into obsessive sign-seeking. Setting boundaries is an equally important safeguard. Without limits, some people begin seeing potential messages in every number plate, overheard sentence, or random headline. Clinicians caution that this can slide into paranoia. Protective practices include only giving attention to coincidences that connect with meaningful, current issues or limiting reflection time. For example, journaling and rereading for a few days rather than weeks. These boundaries keep coincidences tethered to the useful role of illumination, while blocking their expansion into elaborate systems of control. Another constructive way to use synchronicities is as creative fuel. Artists, writers, and entrepreneurs often describe coincidences as sparks for imagination. By treating them as metaphors rather than dictations, material rather than mandate, you can redirect their charge into idea generation. A story that intersects with your work life might prompt a new project. A repeated phrase might inspire a poem or concept. This approach allows synchronicities to enrich creativity without turning them into obligations. Their utility comes from the spark, not from any claim of external instruction. Mindfulness techniques can also ground coincidence experiences. In some therapies, patients are encouraged to recognize coincidences without attaching decision-making power to them. Instead, they record what happened, notice the emotions it stirred, and reflect on the thoughts it revealed. The coincidence becomes an exercise in present moment awareness, a way of mapping what matters internally. rather than an omen predicting external outcomes. This application strengthens resilience while limiting the risk of obsession. The value of these practices lies in balance. Used carefully, synchronicities support reflection, creativity, and self-discovery. Used uncritically, they reinforce magical thinking and ungrounded choices. Journaling, dialogue, time rules, and mindfulness all work to keep the balance intact by reminding you that coincidences reveal more about focus and emotion than about external fate. With this framing, synchronicities act as mirrors of the inner world, highlighting psychological patterns and life themes, while leaving decisions under your control. For some, practicing this careful navigation adds an additional benefit. It reframes the entire debate. Rather than asking whether synchronicity proves cosmic design or cognitive bias, you begin seeing it as evidence of how consciousness filters and organizes experience. The act of noticing, recording, and reflecting shapes how reality appears to you. That creative power is both humbling and liberating. It shows synchronicity can matter greatly without requiring supernatural claims, because it helps you see yourself more clearly. An investigative attitude makes this practical approach even more engaging. By collecting data and analyzing whether coincidences cluster, you replicate the diary methods scientists use in research. For viewers interested in unexplained phenomena, this process turns synchronicity into an experiment, a way of testing whether alignments actually repeat and whether they line up with meaningful moments. It bridges curiosity with method, satisfying the desire for wonder while rooting it in evidence you can track. In this way, synchronicities shift from elusive mysteries into material you can study, compare, and interpret responsibly. The key is resisting the temptation to let coincidences take control. Treat them as signals for self-reflection, not as commands. Allow them to enrich imagination and highlight values, but guard against letting them dictate major choices. By maintaining this balance, synchronicities can coexist with rational thinking, sources of insight that inform you without directing you. Handled in this way, coincidences stop being traps for belief or targets of dismissal. They become working tools, reminders of the mind's attunement to meaning. That grounded approach leaves room for both skepticism and belief, letting synchronicity stand as a bridge rather than a boundary. And once you see them through that lens, you are ready for the final step, recognizing not just how to interpret coincidences, but why they matter in shaping the way we live. In the end, synchronicities matter less as proof of cosmic law and more as reflections of how humans create meaning. Science shows many mechanisms by which we notice and amplify coincidences through attention, the Reticular Activating System, Apophenia, and confirmation bias. Even if they are products of perception, they often change lives by shifting perspective, offering comfort, or sparking decisions. The most constructive way to approach them is as tools for reflection, not commands. To test this for yourself, try a simple experiment. Keep a short log of one coincidence you notice, then comment below with a concise example, and whether it felt meaningful to you or not.